The Practical Prophetic, where prophetic ministry is made practical. I'm Beth Wingate, I'm your host, and welcome to the podcast. On our podcast today, we are going to talk about covenant versus contract. The reason I wanted to bring this today is I was having a theological conversation with someone who's has degrees in theology, and we were talking about Calvinism, Arminianism, once saved, always saved. Can you lose your salvation? All of these kinds of topics. And it got me thinking, because I have a position on this, but I'm open, and I'm very open to hear anyone that wants to bring scripture to me on this. However, I will definitely and emphatically state that I lean toward the idea of once saved, always saved, with a condition. And so that condition is the person truly born again? And so I'm open to that discussion. I'm not really interested in a debate, but I'm definitely open to that discussion. But here's what it got me thinking about. I was also listening to Christian apologist Os Guinness, and he made some comments about the state of our world today and about politics and about how that we live in a time where there's moral relativism, there's postmodernism, and truth seems to be a little fluid these days, just like gender and some of these other issues, and that's the root of that. And he talked about the importance of the French Revolution versus the American Revolution, and how that the French Revolution was a secular revolution, which basically denied God, and then the American Revolution was rooted in covenant and the language of covenant. And it just really set me on a journey of studying and looking at these things for myself. And I thought I would just bring this conversation, this Bible study today. And really, this is prophetic thinking, because when you have this mindset, you're taking the mindset that Moses had at the foundation of the church. And by the way, the church didn't just start in the second chapter of Acts. The church actually started at Sinai, in a sense, at its foundation. And so I just thought I would bring this to us today. I thought this would be an interesting conversation, and I'm just going to talk to you as though you're in the room with me and share with you the things that I have learned and studied about. So at our foundation, at Sinai, we know that Yahweh God called His people out of Egypt, and He made a covenant with them in the wilderness. And so we know that Jesus has a covenant with His bride, the church. And we know that God made a covenant with Abraham. And so what is all this talk of covenant? And we live in a legal society today where everything is about contracts. Now, what's the difference between a covenant and a contract? And that's what I really want to get into, and I hope you'll find this interesting. But so some of the things that are different between a contract and a covenant. So number one would be that the contract is actually under English law, and so all of our law is based on English law, and English law is roughly based on Roman law. And so contracts in the time span of history as a whole are a relatively new thing. And so they are typically a one-way agreement that says, I come into agreement with you, and if you do this, I'll do this, and if you don't do this, then this penalty will be enforced. And those are typically enforced in court, in our legal system. And so a contract is basically a one-way agreement between me and you, or between, one party and another party. And so that is an exchange that takes place. I'll give you this, you give me that. We'll divide the assets this way or that way. And if this is not kept up, then this penalty or that penalty will be enforced. And so there's typically some kind of penalty if that contract is broken. And so it's a legal agreement. However, there's no real morality involved in a contract. It is simply a secular agreement, if you will, a non-religious agreement that you come into. For example, when you go to buy a car, you will sign for a loan and you enter into a contract with the lender, with the bank, that you will make your car payment. And if you don't, then the penalty is they will repossess your car and it will hurt your credit. And so that's how that works. You enter into a legal contract to buy a car. Okay, what is the difference here? What is a covenant? Well, a covenant is more of an ancient idea, an ancient construct, if you will, and it originated at Sinai. In fact, the problems we have today are because people have contract thinking instead of covenant thinking. And this is really the root of our problem. A democracy, for example, will not work without morality. Our founders said that. And so we're seeing our democracy vulnerable in this era of secularism. In fact, our problems is really that secularism has invaded the church, and the church has not made an impact on the secular world the way it should. And so I'll just leave that right there. But a covenant is different. A covenant requires a trust, an oath, which is a moral act. You make a promise before God, and this is a two-way promise. Instead of me and you, it's us. And that's one difference between a contract and a covenant. And so in a covenant, when there's a failure or a breakdown, there's no penalty, there's no way out. It's a forever deal. You are legally bound together as one entity, so to speak. And so it's a promise before God to uphold your end regardless of the other person. In fact, you go into that agreement knowing it is for the benefit of the other person. And so a covenant is very different from a contract. I'm going to give a couple of examples. So I worked at one time for a mortgage company, and we would, back in the early 2000s, before the housing bubble burst, people who had been paying, under previous administrations had homes, and they were paying about 10% interest on their house. I had one customer had paid like 12% interest on their house, and the rates suddenly fell, which is part of why we had the housing bubble crisis. But that's another discussion for another day. So the rates would drastically fall, and they fell somewhere around, 6%. And so it made sense, even if you had been in your home for 10 years, to refinance your mortgage. People were refinancing their mortgages, cashing out some of their equity and remodeling their houses and things like that. Business was good. And so, but occasionally we would run into this issue where someone had an HOA in their neighborhood, and maybe they got into a disagreement with the HOA. Maybe they didn't feel like the HOA was keeping up their end of the bargain. And so they had a lien put on their house by the lien company because they failed to keep their covenants. So let me explain how that would work. There was one lady that lived in a really beautiful neighborhood on the lake, and they had all these amenities offered by the neighborhood, a swimming pool and a clubhouse and, special lighting and people that service the lake and the walking track and all of these kind of things. Well, when she purchased her house, she entered into a covenant. HOAs are one of the only things now where we enter into covenant in daily business transactions. And so she entered into a covenant. And the reason why, by the way, is because it's you share the land that the developer releases to the homeowners association, and that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, so she got into a disagreement over something to do with the amenities offered, and she just quit paying her dues. And so when she went to refinance her house, we could not refinance her house until the lien was satisfied and the interest that had accrued was satisfied. And so, of course, she was very upset, and I ended up handing that off to my manager. It wasn't really my problem after that, but it was shocking to her, and it taught me something though about covenants. They are unconditional. There's no just penalty. No, the covenant had to be satisfied. And so that was a lesson to me about covenants and the power of covenants. And so we know that today, one of the most typical ways we will see a covenant today is in marriage. Of course, in marriage. And so when you get married, and by the way, there's two types of marriage out there. There is a common law marriage, which is a civil union. That's a contract-based marriage. And then there is a religious marriage, a covenant that you make before the Lord. And typically if you do that, you will have a pastor present that will marry you, a reverend, who's a man of God, a man of the cloth. And you will have witnesses, and you have that marriage license. In fact, in ancient times, you would have what's called a ketubah, a contract, a covenant contract that you would sign in ancient and still in modern day Jewish culture. And so I love that idea of signing the covenant. But we make vows now. We have a verbal covenant with people, and when we get married in our modern times. But the marriage covenant is a promise, till death do you part. Even if the other party doesn't keep up their end of the bargain, you've made a covenant. Wow. How powerful is that? And so we know that in a contractual marriage, a common law marriage, a civil union, that the penalties can be spelled out, and then a judge would decide, who gets what, who gets the house, who gets this money, that savings account, this, how they split it. Is it 50-50, and it gets very complex and very complicated, and there's an entire legal industry dedicated to the dissolution of contracts, of the dissolution sometimes of covenant, and that's why it's such a heavy penalty that people pay. And I don't want to go too far down that side. There's no condemnation. If you know someone who's been divorced, that's between them and the Lord to work out. There's scripture laid down that there are certain conditions, unfaithfulness, abuse, whatever, and that's something you can come to your own conclusion. But I'm just talking about the power of a covenant versus a contract. And so a contract is conditional, whereas a covenant is unconditional. And so what is another example of a covenant? And so one of the big ones would be our Declaration of Independence. And our founding fathers understood this, and they spelled it out in plain language that our nation as a people was making a promise before God. And I want to read, this is the concluding last sentence of the Declaration of Independence, just to drive this point home. And it says, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Wow. Now that's powerful. That echoes marriage covenant language. That echoes the kind of language God spoke to His people at Sinai. I'm going to sidebar right here and talk about something. So I've mentioned this, I believe, before on the podcast, but we've been talking about this in our Bible study, and that's about the covenant contract that God would make with His people at Sinai. And then later, when Israel would have a king, the king had to read their covenant contract. It was a treaty, is what they called it in the Bible. It was called a suzerain treaty. And so the king every year had to read this before the people. And the people had to mutually agree. If you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, 3 times the people affirmed before Moses, we agree. Yes, we agree to everything you just said. They would. And so it was the consent of the governed. It was a mutual agreement. It was not me and you. It was not the people and God. It was us. It was the two becoming one, like a marriage. And so when God came to His people, Yahweh God at Sinai, and Moses was the representative of the people, they made a covenant with the Lord that they would obey. In fact, God had Moses go to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and He laid out, here's what would happen. And so everything was laid out. Now let me explain one more element of a covenant versus a contract. In a contract, there are time constraints. We have a thing called the statute of limitations. And so a contract has an expiration date on it, so to speak. After so many years, if someone, does somebody wrong in business, there's really no recourse after so much time passes. However, in a covenant, it is eternal. It is forever. Just like the lady who had not paid her dues for years, she thought she was off the hook till she went to refinance her mortgage, which in a sense is like selling and repurchasing your house from the lender. And so she found out very quickly that lien had to be satisfied, which really segues into my next point. Like I said, in a contract, there's penalties. But in a covenant, this timeless covenant, it requires forgiveness. It requires understanding. It requires sitting down to the table and working out your problems because you're in this together. In fact, I'll share another example. Just my family has been entrepreneurial. My parents have owned businesses. I've owned a business. My brother's owned a business. My brother-in-law owns a business. And so we're very entrepreneurial minded. And so I don't know much about it, but know a little bit about business. So there's basically just a few ways you can enter into a business. One would be like a sole proprietorship, where basically you and the business are sort of tangled into one. And sometimes that, if you're not careful with your accounting and your money, that can get people into tax trouble because your personal finance and your business finance are rolled into one. Then there's what we have called an LLC. That's what most businesses are. That stands for limited liability corporation, and that's sort of a hybrid where you have a little more restriction and the money needs to be kept somewhat separate, but there can be some overlap and your personal liability is limited, and that's to protect you. And then there's this third kind of business, which, by the way, I recommend going into business this way. This is what we always did, and it's called an incorporation. So in an incorporation, the business is its own entity, its own person, if you will, and you have people who basically manage it, and the accounts have to be completely separate. It's a little more expensive on the up end, but and there's different, more strict laws and regulations and rules, but in essence, it protects you. For example, we were told by our attorney that when we took out our business, we had to draw up incorporation papers, and so if someone gets injured at our place of business, then we are not personally held liable. The business is held liable because it's its own entity, and that's a whole nother conversation. But in essence, it sort of spells out what we're talking about. These contracts versus you have covenant. And really, in a sole proprietorship, you're in covenant, so to speak, with your business, whereas in a corporation, it's its own entity, it's separate, and it sort of like spells out the example of contract. And so it's a little bit different. But let me talk about this too. What are some other ways? What are some other examples of covenants that we see in our everyday culture? Well, I'll give you one of the most beautiful examples outside of marriage, outside of the Lord with His people, and outside of an HOA, and the reason that's always a thing is because, like I said, you're sharing land. It's different from a contract. And then my other example would be with a baby, with your children. You have a covenant with your children. And that can include adoption. You can adopt in a child to be your child. But when a child is born, they have a covenant relationship with you. They don't really bring anything to the table other than themselves. And it is your responsibility, because of the love that God put in your heart for your baby that's a part of you, to take care of that baby, to feed that baby, to raise that baby. And so a covenant, and it's regardless of if they hold up their end or not. Parents love their children unconditionally. Whether they approve or disapprove of behavior, they love their children unconditionally, just as Christ loves the church. I want to give us some scriptures to sort of drive all of this home, and I really felt impressed to bring this today because I really believe it'll bless you and encourage you. Let's go to Matthew 19, and I'm going to read verses 4 through 6, and this is in the NIV. It says, some Pharisees came to him, meaning Jesus, to test him, and they said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife, and for any and every reason? And Jesus said, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And so I want to talk about that for just a minute. And I'm going to sort of shift gears on our message today, on our discussion about covenant versus contract. You may have relationships in your life that are contractual. This goes back to the lesson of the hireling, the servant, and the friend. If you've never heard that lesson, which is really connected to that outer court, inner court, and holy of holies. And I know I've got to work it into everything I talk about because it's so important. It's the pattern. It's the template that God gave us. We are living temples, and a temple is made up of 3 parts: outer court, inner court, and holy of holies, represented by our flesh, soul, and spirit. Some of your relationships are outer court relationships. Those are like the leaves on the tree. And then you have inner court relationships. The outer court is like that hireling. And then you have inner court relationships. That's that servant level made up of your soul, like the branches on a tree. In a storm, those branches can give you some support, but sometimes those branches can fall, and they'll take leaves with them, and they'll leave a scar on the tree, and that'll preach right there. And then you have that highest level represented by the Spirit and the Holy of Holies, and that's that covenantal level. And not very many people fit in that area. It's like a funnel. It funnels down and gets smaller and smaller, all those levels. And your family is really the main people outside of the Lord that fit in that place. And you can have a covenant relationship with a very close friend or mentor, and they become a surrogate sister, brother, mother, father, something like that. But they take on that role, and you can have that kind of a bond and friendship like David did with Jonathan. But not many people fit in that place, that Holy of Holies place. And so I believe that is what this is talking about. And so when people interfere in someone else's covenant relationships, they should proceed with caution. That is dangerous. When someone has a marriage, and let's say their marriage is going through trouble, you have to cheer them on, encourage them, support them, pull for their marriage to work. You never want to be someone who is interfering in someone's covenant relationship. It says, what God has joined together, let no one separate. You don't want to come in between that. You want to always take a biblical stand. Now, that's not excusing bad behavior or things like that. Always have to be supportive of covenant. If there's a parent and a child, and maybe they're estranged, you should always be on the side of reconciliation. Now, of course, if there's abuse or things like that, that's for them to work out, and you need to be reasonable. But if that's not the case, then we should always push for reconciliation in a covenant relationship. That is right. That is righteous. That is to be in right standing with God. And so I wanted to bring up that scripture. Another one is Romans 8:15. It says, the Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by Him we cry, Abba, Father. And that word for sonship comes from a Greek word that means full legal standing of an heir. And so that becomes your salvation. You become a son of the King in heaven, Jesus. And so we are adopted in to the kingdom of God with all the rights and benefits and covenant with God. We have a covenantal relationship, not a contractual relationship with the Lord. And so when you get born again, when you go down that Romans road of salvation, and I'll post that in the description box, then you have all the rights and all the promises that the Lord has for you as a covenant family member. You're not in contract. It's not a business agreement with the Lord, just like a marriage, just like a child with a parent. You're in covenant. And we said a covenant is a promise, an oath, a moral act that you take on, that you're going to hold up your end regardless, that it is unconditional, that it is timeless, and that it requires forgiveness. It requires working things out, working through things. You don't have a right to get angry at God when things don't go the way you think that they should go, because you're in a covenant with Him as your Father. So that relationship is eternal. It's eternal. Think about that. It's eternal, meaning forever, for eternity, beyond your time here on this earth. That's heavy. That's really heavy to think about. And so some of those examples of a covenant relationship, like we said, a marriage, a child with a parent, Jesus with His church, the bride. You know, there's a little old saying that blood is thicker than water. And so that didn't just come out of anywhere. People have said that for a reason, because it's an echo of the idea of covenant. And so the next time you're in a relationship with someone in your family, or maybe in your marriage, or things like that, think about it in terms of covenant. Those people are your ride or die people. And I believe there can be covenant friendships and things like David and Jonathan said as that example. And so we need to have an attitude of covenant, spiritual, moral, oath covenants that are eternal, unbreakable, unconditional. Some people enter into marriage with an idea of a contract. And when things don't go the way they want, when they're not happy, when they don't think their needs are being met, then they want to break a contract. But a marriage is not a contract, it's a covenant. A relationship with your family is not a contract, it's a covenant. And your relationship with the Lord is not a contract, it's a covenant. So I hope this has at least got you thinking today. And this is prophetic language, because this is the language of the kingdom. This is the language of the kingdom. I can't say that enough. Think in covenantal thinking. Think higher than you've been thinking. And so I hope this challenged you. I hope this encourages you and blesses you as you consider a covenant mindset versus a contractual mindset. Have a blessed day. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be informed next time I post. Thank you again, and have a blessed day.